Before we dive into introductions, I do want to mention that if you have questions throughout today's session, whether it be during the panel section or the presentation section, we encourage you to leverage the Q&A function of Zoom. We have a team on the back end that's monitoring that, and we'll be sure to bring up those questions live as we have time towards the end of today's event in a Q&A section. So feel free to leverage Q&A for any questions that you might have. With that, let's dive into introductions. My name is Emily Lucas, and I'm the Director of Customer Success here at Replica. I'm joined today by a number of esteemed panelists, and I want to give them a chance to introduce themselves and tell them a little bit about themselves. So Leslie, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Leslie Richards. I am the General Manager and CEO of SEPTA. That's the transit agency in the Philadelphia region. We're the 5th largest transit agency in the country, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Leslie. Matthew, do you want to go next? Oh, it looks like you might be muted.
And never run smoothly as you want. Hi, everybody. My name is Matthew Safer. I'm the Senior Director of Demand Forecasting and Research at New Jersey Transit. And I head up a group here that does ridership analysis. We've been very busy over the pandemic, tracking various trends. As I like to say, we track ridership past, present, and future throughout our agency, which is the largest statewide transit agency in the country.
Wonderful. Great to have you, Matthew. Thomas, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm Thomas Orgren. I'm a senior transportation planner and data scientist from Foursquare ITP. We specialize in helping our clients incorporate data-driven insights into transit service planning, among other things. And so Replica data is increasingly becoming a big part of that practice.
Great. Thanks, Thomas. And Arthur, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, thanks, Emily, and hi, everyone. Very excited to participate today. I work at Replica as well, and I'm a senior solutions engineer here. I spent the last decade of my career at New York City DOT, where I got a chance to play with tools like Replica and participated in some transit planning, particularly our bus route expansion in New York City. But now I get a chance to work with our customers and leverage data in all types of ways to help them. And I hopefully will share some of that with you today.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. As we've likely all experienced, the pandemic has dramatically changed the way that we move around our communities. And as a result, our existing transportation plans no longer reflect reality. And so while transit agencies across the country are working to meet those evolving needs of riders, it's imperative that they have access to quality near real-time data and forecasting tools to understand this new normal that we're living in, and also to help implement meaningful interventions and then also monitor that impact over time. So we'll kind of move into our panel discussion. And one thing before we dive in and start asking questions, want to set the table of how those changes have impacted both us regionally, but also nationally at kind of a national scale. And so Leslie, I'd like to have you, if you don't mind, just kind of set the table for us of what you've seen at a national scale in terms of impacts of the pandemic.
Sure. So we've seen a lot of changes, of course, changes in demographics, changes in work schedules. We've seen telecommuting. We've seen a lower concentration of peak travel times, where we used to see a lot of people leaving to get into work by a certain time and report to an office and leave at a specific time. We're seeing people using transit throughout the day. What we talk about at SEPTA and many across the country, going from a peak time schedule to a lifestyle schedule. We're seeing people use us not only more throughout the day, but also on weekends. And that need has definitely increased. And so the need for frequent scheduling and different routes working at those times is important as well. We've also seen, when I mentioned demographics, we've seen an increase in women using transit. We've seen an increase of people of color using transit. And again, using it for all different reasons, to do errands during the day, to get the groceries, to take their children places, to visit parents, to check in on people, to take care of medical appointments, prescriptions. And we also see, trip chaining that we see as more women use our system. So they'll use it multiple times a day, not just once to go in and once to come out. And so we're following that. Just to give you a little background on the Philly area, where we'll be discussing a little bit about SEPTA. We have been described, I think it's an accurate description, as the largest poorest city in the United States. Nearly a quarter of all Philadelphians are under or near the poverty line. And these residents obviously are very dependent on transit for mobility to jobs, healthcare, childcare, education. As I mentioned before, food shopping, getting prescriptions, going to the pharmacy, all essential destinations. And almost 200,000 Philadelphia residents and nearly 300,000 Southeastern Pennsylvanians do not have access to a vehicle, and they rely on SEPTA to reach their destinations. We carry about 600,000 trips daily. I'm going to talk a little bit about the reduction in those trips. We were carrying a little over 1 million before the pandemic. But clearly, transit options, accessibility have had a tremendous impact on a large percentage of our city-based populations. And their needs and demands on their lives depend on how they can get around and move around. The only way we can truly meet these changing needs, and they're changing quickly, is to understand why are they using transit, how are they using transit, and other factors that come into play. So we're really happy to be part of this discussion, which is going to help us get that type of information. I just wanted to give a quick overview. While this last quarter, SEPTA has seen its highest ridership since the pandemic. We've gotten to 70% of our bus ridership is back, and that's where it was before the pandemic. We're at 50% on our regional rail, which is great, approaching about 50% on our subways and our trolleys. I do want to talk about what we are seeing, because I think I know transit agencies across the country are seeing these things too. And that is issues with our vulnerable population, which includes those experiencing homelessness, those addicted to opioids and other drugs, and those dealing with mental health issues. We're seeing crime impacting and the perception of crime, by the way, impacting how safe people feel on our system, whether they want to come back on the system, how they use our system. I mentioned before an increase in work from home opportunities that we've been seeing, and obviously whether people need to be on our system or not. And then also there's workforce challenges that I just want to mention, where there's a shortage of finding good, talented people to work in a variety of different jobs. And this is also impacting the type of service that we can put out, as well as projects that are ongoing. I know across the country, I talked to my colleagues quite a bit just about inflation, how materials cost more, personnel costs more, different supply side issues that the pandemic brought on, which also makes things quite complicated. So I just wanted to give that overall strategy that we have to plan for, and these changes and how quickly they're coming. And like I said, transit agencies across the country are dealing with these challenges that none of us have ever dealt with before, and working together to figure them out.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that context, Leslie. And I think, like you said, they're unprecedented challenges that we're all facing, but hopefully opportunities to build off each other's expertise and leverage the tools that we have to make impacts for our communities. Matthew, I'm curious, I'm sure you're experiencing similar things in New Jersey, but would love to hear how you all are approaching it.
Yeah, very much so. One thing that is unique about New Jersey Transit is we are a statewide transit agency. We have a variety of different markets and really cover a very wide geographic area. We have, a very extensive urban local bus market, in addition to our commuter bus market, both to New York City and Philadelphia, which are different. We have a commuter rail market, which tends to be higher income, more employment oriented. And then we have throughout the state a lot of suburban, and in some cases even rural local buses. And really what we've seen is we've seen each of these markets reacting somewhat differently to the pandemic. Initially, in the initial stages of the pandemic, we saw dramatic declines, particularly on the services that were employment oriented, particularly to Manhattan, which are both on our bus system and on our commuter rail system. The portions of the system that maintained ridership were areas that we would often consider to be more transit dependent. A lot of our local bus routes in South Jersey, in the rural and suburban areas that are, we would consider to be more coverage service. But over time, as work and normal travel patterns have reemerged, those markets that didn't decline as much also haven't rebounded as much. We are back at or above 80% on our bus ridership in North Jersey, both our local North Jersey urban service and also our North Jersey commuter service to New York City. We're still down in about 60% of pre-pandemic normal on our South Jersey, which is, as I said, more suburban, more transit dependent in general. Now, our commuter rail system, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of our service, at the depths of the pandemic, we were down, single digits of pre-pandemic normal. We have rebounded up to between 50 and 60%, approaching 60% of pre-pandemic normal. The one thing we have noticed is that the elasticities of these of our ridership is much higher. Day of the week is much different. Mondays and Fridays are significantly down from what we saw pre-pandemic. And any individual additional friction that we see in terms of weather, in terms of holidays, and in terms of days off school, we see our ridership down significantly more than we would have seen pre-pandemic. So while our ridership, in many cases is on weekdays is recovering, the variability is much higher. In terms of choice riders, particularly on weekends and evenings, we are seeing significantly higher recovery and nearly approaching pre-pandemic. In some cases, we are over pre-pandemic normals in terms of particularly weekend ridership for recreational travel, particularly to New York City. That's on both our bus and our rail system. So we, as I mentioned, we have a lot of different markets. Each one has very different nuances in terms of the specific demographics that we see there and the type of employment and the types of trips that they serve.
I'm curious, with the various networks that you have, are you operating under the assumption that this is kind of the new baseline, the new normal that you're working from, or do you still expect there to be some return to normal or regression?
Personally, I think we will see a continued slow recovery. But a lot of those numbers sort of will get washed out in our normal seasonal variation, where we see, higher fall levels of service, higher fall levels of ridership, and then lower in the winter as weather is worse, and the additional shifts we see in the summer with less peak service or less peak ridership and more recreational travel. We may continue to see, as we look at the long-term trend line, a slow and steady increase. Will we get back to pre-pandemic? Eventually, I feel like we will backfill due to demographic growth and market growth, but they will be different riders. Not everybody who was there pre-pandemic obviously will come back, and it will take us a while to get back to 100% on many of our markets.
Thomas, I'm curious for you, since Foursquare ITP works with clients, kind of across the country, are you seeing similar trends? Are there changes based on the size of the agencies you're working with?
Yeah, so we've seen pretty similar trends. A lot of our markets that we work in are similar northeastern legacy cities, Baltimore and DC. But DC and Baltimore had very different trajectories. DC is a largely commuter-based system designed around getting people downtown. that ridership there fell off a cliff, whereas in Baltimore, they retained about a third of their bus ridership at the worst of the pandemic, which is actually much higher in most areas, because demographically it's more similar to like what you see in Philly, a lot of low-income riders who were still relying on the services. One underappreciated thing that's changing the way transit is operating, and it's less about where the passengers are going and more about where the drivers are going, is that the growth of delivery services and like Amazon, those type large warehouse delivery type things are actually putting pressure on the supply of operators in a lot of places. So we're seeing a lot of systems are struggling just to train and retain enough operators with CDLs to operate the service. And we also see that in ridership patterns in Baltimore, for example. The only routes that are doing better than they were pre-pandemic are the ones that are serving these warehouse distribution areas. So yeah, just the whole change of shopping in person versus shopping at home has actually put some weird pressure on transit too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious, with all of these changes that we're undertaking nationwide and in the different regions that you all are serving, how has that impacted your need for data-driven decision making? How does your reliance maybe on data changed or stayed the same?
We were pretty heavily integrating data into our planning before the pandemic, but the pandemic has definitely changed what data we need. So before the pandemic, like census travel flows for work-based or systems that were based around commuters were pretty useful for route planning, but now that data is so out of date, it's hardly useful. So the need for more recent post-pandemic travel flow data has been pretty acute. And yeah, we're just collecting different kinds of data and analyzing that instead of the normal ridership, crowding, on-time performance that we were looking at before. Now we're also looking at unplanned service cuts and other sorts of pandemic-related changes.
Well, Leslie or Matthew, anything that you all want to share on that?
Yeah, I can definitely share. We really do need the data because people are traveling differently, and it's not even how they're using our system, but it's even how are they getting to our system. I know we'll probably talk a little bit about this, but it does matter, right? How are they accessing our system? Are they walking? Are they biking? Are they, using surface lots that are at our regional rail commuter? All of that is really important, and making sure that, we have all of that information, and also how people, are not using our system. That has become very important. Are people making car trips that are a mile or less, or how are they getting around? And how are communities, using transit or not using transit is important. We are seeing, I do want to mention in some of the conversation, I think it's important to note that while, we use the term ridership, that the ridership is down, but in many cases, I'm not quite sure if the number of riders are as significantly down as the trips are down. I think many people are using us less frequently. So, for instance, if someone is, using us 3 days a week instead of 5, it's going to look like we've lost riders where we haven't. And so figuring that out as well is very important for our data.
Absolutely, Leslie. As I mentioned, the variability is just much higher in terms of days of the week, in terms of numbers of trips per week, per day. And one of the things we're really trying to mine, data sources such as Replica for is not only what are our riders doing, because we have various ways of getting at that through rider surveys or focus groups, or even just our internal systems. But what are the people who used to ride, who we no longer see? What are they doing, or what are they not doing? Is it that they're no longer traveling for work? Is it that they're not comfortable with transit anymore for health reasons? All of these things, and Are they not making trips anymore? And that's one of the things that we really are trying to take a look at, market by market, and really try to determine what's going on, not just on our system, but in the travel markets as a whole.
Yeah, Leslie, you touched on this a little bit already, but how are you incorporating that pandemic related mode shift to maybe private auto or to cycling or maybe even walking in your planning now? How has that impacted SEPTA?
Yeah, so, our team is working on a micromobility plan book right now, and the data and Replica is really helping us with that as well. So it's looking at neighborhoods. It's looking, it's very interesting in when we look at low income neighborhoods, where are larger percentages of people traveling to work by bicycle? Where are they using transit? What are the other options that we're seeing? And we want to see not only who, where they're getting on, where are they getting off? And also, how can we best support these communities? I also want to mention, because I know time is, never long enough in these situations. So I'd say it's our micromobility playbook, which is going to be very, very important, of how they access transit, how they use our what's difficult, what's easy, how can we work with other partners as well. But then we're also looking at all of our bus routes for our bus revolution, which is a comprehensive bus network design. And that is also very important for us to see, again, as I've mentioned, what type of car trips exist right now. How are people using personal vehicles? Could we make buses easier for them to use? We here at SEPTA, and I think other transit agencies are in the same boat, we have not done a comprehensive bus network redesign in quite some time. Here at SEPTA, it's been 60 years that we've looked at everything. During the pandemic, we passed a free transfer, and yet we never took a comprehensive look at our entire system of how could people leverage that free transfer in a variety of ways so that it could have the best equitable outcomes for everyone. And so we're taking a look at that now. And in just, in talking to communities about this change, and it is significant, and they haven't had this type of comprehensive change in a long time, the data is so important for us to show how we're looking at frequency, for us to show how we're looking at the length of our routes, for us to show the frequency of how they can get people, how straight or how curved, all these types of decisions that get made when you look at routes and where they should be and where they should go. And the geographic areas, in explaining to communities that don't like change or scared of change or don't fully understand how it's going to impact them. The data is really helping us explain why we are doing it, how it's going to increase frequency, reliability, things that they need in a transit system, things that they deserve in a transit system. And then also helping us describe how that interacts with our workforce shortages and other challenges that we have.
Thanks for sharing that, Leslie. I know that equity really got pushed to the forefront with pandemic, impacts. And so that's a good thing. And I think something we're all striving for, but appreciate you sharing, how you all are approaching it at SEPTA. Thomas, I'm curious for you, because you are serving multiple different agencies, how does equity come to play with the work you're doing?
I mean, it's front and center in everything we're doing. Certainly, we're always looking at the data, looking at the available census data, looking at route surveys to understand who is aboard, and making sure that we're always making changes that are going to benefit people as much as possible. Specifically the equity targeted groups. One thing that that we've been incorporating a lot more is using Replica data to help understand how low-income minority users without access to cars, they're traveling, which is something you don't always get from census data, because you can't necessarily cross-tab to say, who lives in an area and kind of what trips they're taking. But with the Replica data, we can actually have a better idea of who's taking exactly what trips. And So especially with planning microtransit, which our clients are asking us to do a lot more as they're considering other options for dealing with their operator shortages or low productivity on some of their suburban routes in less dense places. The replica data is really helping us get that equity piece out of our or into our planning as well.
I know we've mentioned, women, but also low wage workers are really important, and what Thomas just mentioned. That's where the data is really helping us, just seeing when people need to be places and where, and that has changed since the pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's so great that we're able to discuss, kind of these challenges that we're all facing in different communities and share expertise and brainstorm and share the importance of data. And I hate to cut the conversation short, but I know we also have presentations from Thomas and Arthur today that we also want to share, and questions that are coming in that we want to leave time for at the end. So I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can move into our focus on micromobility. Or microtransit rather, like Thomas mentioned. But thank you all for sharing your thoughts, and for the audience members, keep sharing your questions with us, and we'll funnel them to the Q&A section at the end. All right, Thomas, I'll go ahead and pass over to you to start covering microtransit.
All right, thanks, Emily. So I am going to talk about how we're using replica data to assess microtransit suitability. In this case, this project specifically is in Jacksonville, Florida, for the Jacksonville Transit Administration. You can go ahead to the next slide. So Jacksonville, the JTA tasked us with helping them prioritize conversion of their existing Ready Ride system, which was a dial-a-ride system with on-demand zones where you actually pick up a phone and call into dispatch to get a ride. They wanted to modernize that into a more modern app-based microtransit service. So that's more like an Uber pool where you're picking up your phone and going into the app and scheduling a ride that is on public vehicles, but it may be shared with other folks as well. But it's a point-to-point ride. So the issue is how to project demand for microtransit service to prioritize these zones for conversion, given the available data. Microtransit is a little unique compared to fixed route transit in that to know how many vehicles you need, it's less about, you're with fixed route, you're just targeting a certain headway and putting vehicles on the road to match. With demand responsive transit, you've got to match the number of vehicles to the number of passengers. So you can go ahead to the next slide. So in the days of doing this, before we had access to the replica data, it was kind of like, planning in the dark with sunglasses on. We were kind of using a whole bunch of different data sources to obliquely get at the answer of who's actually taking short internal trips within the zone. So we were using census data, we were using regional travel model data where it was available, household travel surveys, transit ridership, paratransit ridership. And the issue is none of those quite answer the question. So you have limited data on what trip types and times are happening. So census data was limited to work trips only. A lot of regional travel models will give you non-work trips, but they won't give you specific types of non-work trips, and they won't give you the demographics of who's using that. You're kind of stuck with a fixed geographic resolution, so your census block groups or your TAZs or whatever, where oftentimes those break along major roads, and an ideal microtransit zone will often straddle a major road. So the existing transit ridership data, it didn't tell the full story, and that's what you're seeing in the graph here is ridership on the existing Ready Ride system, but it's very low. I mean, this is fewer than 1 passenger per hour every time of day, except for the 2 p.m. hour. And the randomness of it makes it hard to use. And the other big issue, which I mentioned in the panel discussion, is that census data is still stuck reporting what was going on a few years ago, just based on the time lag of like ACS data. and getting the new results integrated. So right now, you're not seeing the true story of what's happening after the pandemic. If you're looking at census data, you're looking mostly at pre-pandemic patterns with a few random pandemic era patterns scattered in there. So not very helpful for microtransit, where you're trying to plan service in much less dense areas. So that's the other issue, is that resolution falls off a cliff with census data when you get to kind of the levels of density that work for microtransit. You can go to the next slide, Emily. So planning data or planning microtransit with Replica has definitely been much more effective to actually get to the heart of who's traveling where and who might use microtransit. So we're getting higher resolution travel flow data that includes detailed info on the trip purpose. So I know if you're going to work or shopping or to school or coming back home from that activity. We know how far you're going, how long it took you to get there, and exactly what mode you were taking. So we can use all those to feed into our operational assumptions, knowing that a certain number of trips might shift over to microtransit. We can get custom geographies, which kind of in the middle of this map, you see along Beach Road, there's a little bit on the north side of the road, which if we were glued to the census geographies, we wouldn't be able to throw in just the shopping centers just on the north side of the road without including the entire block group. We're also able to cross-tab by demographics. So that's really important, as we mentioned in the panel discussion, to understand not just how all trips are happening, but specifically trips by low-income riders, riders without cars, female riders who are trip chaining. Just to be able to really focus in on the groups who you're trying to help most has been really helpful, and especially if you're planning a means tested system, as we've been doing for some systems. And the next slide, please. So some of the other real big advantages that this has unlocked is we're getting both weekday and Saturday data. Census travel flow data was only giving us weekday, and it's not giving us the start and end times. So in this graph to the right, you're seeing our estimated microtransit demand based on the internal trips happening in the zone throughout the day. And what's really interesting here is if you were looking at kind of a traditional data source, you might assume that the peaks happen at traditional times, 8 a.m., 5 p.m. But with this zone, you're seeing your peaks are actually happening at 12 p.m. and 4 p.m. on the weekdays. And you're getting even more travel flows within the zone on Saturdays. I mean, this is a zone out by the beach, so maybe there's more recreational shopping trips happening. And so in areas where microtransit makes sense, that's often the case, where you've got a lot of Saturday ridership you're trying to capture, and the Replica data really helps us get into that. So we're also getting data for trips of all modes. So as I was saying, we can apply some things we know about what kind of trips might be more likely to switch over to microtransit than others, because there's a lot of induced demand to microtransit. When you make it easier to schedule a trip with an app, more people start to use it. We're seeing in all the areas that we're implementing this. And of course, the big thing is that there's post-pandemic data available. So I can plan based on what was happening in 2021 and not 2019, which now more than ever is a huge, huge important thing to do. So the Replica data has really helped us with our clients to really get to the heart of what's going on with microtransit. And so it's been a huge help, and we're really appreciative to have that data at our fingertips.
Wonderful. Thanks, Thomas. And thanks for sharing your application. It's helpful for us to see, and I know probably the folks in this audience as well. If you have questions for Thomas, feel free to keep adding them to the Q&A, and we'll bring them up in the Q&A section. But thanks again for sharing. And Arthur, I'll go ahead and pass over to you.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thanks, Thomas. That was really interesting. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and jump into my portion of the presentation. So this is an analysis that I wanted to highlight, because this is something that I was looking into specifically around the Houston area for ridership in Houston, and looking at kind of the new normal and what's possible with Replica data. So just first of all, I wanted to touch on Replica's process, and we do ingest ridership data. I know a question came across about, which GTFS feeds do we ingest into our data set. We do have feeds nationally. Now we have some limits on the amount of agents, on the number of agencies that we feature. For the most part, it's the vast majority across the country. If an agency has typically has less than 500 daily boardings per route, so if it's that size, that's something where we will likely limit and not ingest. However, we've made some exceptions in the past. And that's largely due to, customers asking us, hey, this is something that, I'm interested in. So please, in your next model run, please include this transit agency. So that's typically the sort of guidelines of how we ingest GTFS feeds, but we do reach out nationally and get the vast majority of feeds. And we get pretty granular data that is largely a lot of times not published online. And sometimes oftentimes transit agencies will share that with us in the interest of using it themselves. We also ingest things like census data, location-based data, but I think our population synthesis and our disaggregate model really means that beyond any data set that we're ingesting, or beyond any one data set, we're able to kind of account for everyone and think about ridership for everyone. I just stepped on the space bar, and that's why we jumped ahead a couple of slides there. So very typical when we're doing this live. But yeah, a couple of the metrics and attributes that we can look at with our data. We do have temporal data as well as geospatial and demographic data. So what that means is that we can look at data for a season, on a weekday and a weekend basis, and also at the time of day, which Thomas has talked about a little bit. And then geospatially, we're not just looking at a region or a transit agency. We can look at line level data as well as stop level data. And then we can also think about how ancillary travel happens, to what Leslie was speaking about earlier, how other modes come into play. And I'll try to touch on that, a little bit of that as well. And then demographically and socioeconomically, we can think about actual riders that are using your systems. So that includes things like race, ethnicity, income and household income. Auto ownership, I think, is very important to think about those that don't have access to private autos in their household. So these sorts of metrics. So today, what I wanted to touch on, and this is just a brief background, I want to look at in the Houston region, the new ridership and what that looks like, as well as understanding certain service planning opportunities based on time of day analysis. We can also look at the transit popularity and resiliency of transit on the route level, which I think is a very important level to look at transit on, as opposed to thinking about transit riders as a monolith, actually diving down into very specific people that use specific lines or specific parts of our communities, those riders in specific. And then finally, I'll touch a little bit on which routes might be well integrated with other modes and how we can learn from them, specifically in the Houston region. So here we have a kind of a baseline for Houston. This is from our app. It's the weekday ridership in 2019. And you can see that we have 190,000 trips by about 112,000 trip takers. But then we can also monitor on the right-hand side, you'll see a time series where we can monitor transit ridership in Houston or in Harris County, Texas, which is what Houston Metro services. From, I set the baseline as January 2019 through the last full month of available data, January 2023, to see how mode share has been changing or how resilient transit is. Now, I wanted to dive into the application to show you how this looks like in a more recent time frame, but I don't think we have quite enough time, so maybe I'll skip that part of the presentation and just run through my slides so we can have enough time for Q&A. So this is a comparison or a summary of ridership by income over comparing the pre-COVID era to the new normal. So looking at fall of 2019 versus fall of 2021, a typical weekday in those seasons. So in orange, we have the new normal ridership by income category. And in blue is the pre-COVID ridership by income category. And then that green line series is the percent change, which corresponds with the second y-axis. So what I see here and what I can glean here is that the greatest declines in percentage terms were with the highest income groups, which is not going to be a surprise for some of our panelists as well as some of our attendants. That's kind of what we're seeing across the board, that the income groups with the greatest access to working from home are the ones that are now ceasing to participate in ridership. But interestingly, the lower income groups also saw some great declines on a raw basis. So the under 20K demographic for those with an income actually accounted for 27% of total ridership loss. So I think it's very important to note that there are kind of ridership losses across the board that are interesting to dive into. Now, looking at the trip purpose, we had some discussion about how different purposes really matter and how we've seen certain trip purposes rebound and become sort of the new normal success stories for transit ridership. And this in Houston, this is also echoed here. And so you can see that commutes to work have actually declined by over 50%. In the new normal period. However, shopping trips are pretty resilient. So shopping trips have fallen by only just about 20%, which is well below average. So it's interesting to kind of dig into shopping trips and think about what is happening there and how we can realign service to account for that. And speaking about sort of realigning service, so similar to what we heard earlier about a service based on peak hours versus more of a ridership based more on lifestyle changes. This is a comparison of the weekday trip distribution by hour or by time of day as compared to the service distribution of Houston Metro. And so you can see that there's quite a bit of disconnect there with when or there's a couple of gaps, I should say, of when people are relying on transit versus when the service is scheduled around, which is typically a little bit more peak oriented. And so one statistic that I pulled out of here, I found that at 3 p.m. ridership is represents nearly 10% of trips. However, it represents about 6% of service. So that's something that I think could be a good opportunity to dig into and plan around. And then, finally, we can look at sort of the line level popularity and resiliency of riderships. So you can see that obviously the red line, Metro Rail, there is the thickest line, and it's clearly vastly the most popular in Houston. However, number 2 is the Westheimer bus route, which is still very popular, and it even comes ahead of another Metro Rail line, which is important. And so I tried to dig a little bit more into Westheimer and think about what is happening on that route. And one thing that we can look at is the change in the route popularity, specifically looking again at fall of 2019 as compared with fall of 21. We can look at how different lines have changed and how different lines are, to what degree they're resilient. Ridership is resilient on different lines. So here, this map, the color represents the percent change, with the darkest sort of reds and pinks being the greatest declines in ridership, and the lighter colors being smaller declines, with some of the yellow lines you see are actually 0% declines or even small gains in ridership. And the raw change in numbers is the thickness or the width of the line. So you can see to what degree kind of ridership is falling on a relative basis for the entire agency, or for the entire service, versus to what degree it's falling relative to each transit line. And some insights here that I found were and they're on the left-hand side. While a few of the park and ride routes have some of the greatest losses, Westheimer line is actually a park and ride line that has saw average trip losses, and then some park and ride lines actually saw slight increases. So very interestingly there, I think that this particular case tells a story that is a little bit different, and there's a little bit, there's some insight to be gained about ridership in those perhaps higher income brackets, and for those people that might be actually driving to take transit. And based on that kind of assumption or that hypothesis, I wanted to dig in a little deeper. So I looked at how different route popularity compared to distances from the homes of ridership. So the average distance from the home of the riders of each line is the color of the lines, and then the width again, or the thickness of the line, is the weekly or the weekday ridership in fall of 2021. And so this type of analysis can also be used for something that Leslie mentioned earlier, some like prioritizing bike or micromobility infrastructure to stops that demand it. And in fact, this is something that MTA in New York City has recently done, using our data and kind of prioritizing where the demand for that type of infrastructure is highest in New York City. But here I wanted to look at, greater distances to look at where car or auto ridership might intersect with route popularity. And actually some of the farthest distances to home do have lower ridership on those lines. So you can see that in some of, on the Baytown Park and Ride bus route, for instance, and then some of the other Park and Ride lines. However, once again, Westheimer is sort of an outlier. It is in the top 5th percentile of trips and the top 10th percentile by distance to home. So in other words, it's high in trips despite being far from the homes of trip takers. So it's interesting for me to see, why is Westheimer sort of bucking the trend, and what might be happening there, and what can we learn from it to really, plan around and improve service based on where it's successful. And so based on that, statistic of Westheimer, I wanted to look at, isolate ridership on Westheimer, and that's something you can do in the application is, select a route or even select a stop and look at how ridership there differs from the entirety of, ridership for Houston Metro in this case, or for even other modes as well. So here I just compared Westheimer ridership to the transit ridership for the entirety of Houston Metro. And you can see that Westheimer is actually successful despite ridership coming from higher income groups, which we typically associate with, those working from home, those having access to work from home. And also that success comes despite households that have more access to private automobiles than the average ridership. So you might be asking, okay, what's the bottom line here? Why is Westheimer ridership this successful? And I think the trip purpose can really give us some insight here. And we can see at the bottom here is the top 5 trip purposes for Westheimer versus the system as a whole. And you can see that the shopping is a much larger share of trips for Westheimer than it is for the entirety of the system. And looking at the route that Westheimer, or where Westheimer is on, it's evident that it's, and some of actually the stop popularity, it's actually evident that one of the most popular stops is at the Galleria Mall in Houston. For those familiar, this happens to be one of the, I believe it's actually the largest mall in Houston. And so this really shows us a very specific type of trip where riders have found success and utility in that service to the mall. And perhaps these are riders that, yes, might be working from home and can afford to do that, but they still find value in using a park and ride line for something like shopping on the weekend and in the middle of the day. And so what I would do next in this analysis is see where similar riders are by demographic and by socioeconomic profile to identify who else might stand to benefit from better access to transit to encourage sort of similar types of trips. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much. And I'm going to pivot to the Q&A portion of our analysis.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arthur. A couple of questions that came in that I think probably are best suited for you since you just wrapped up. One is just our approach to validation at Replica for the data outputs that you're focusing on today.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we do validate all of our data sets based on, and I think one of the most important inputs to our model is ground truth data. And we ask for ground truth data. We scrub publicly available data to get ground truths for transit ridership at as granular of a level as possible. We also do that for things like, auto counts and freight vehicle counts. But we do work with our customers and try to ask our customers for even more granular data than what's publicly available. And about 50% of the time, we find that there is more granularly available data than what transit agencies publish online. So that is a very important data set to both calibrate our model, but also to then publish validation reports, which we make publicly accessible.
Great, thank you. We do have lots of questions coming in, so I'll start to kind of just pepper the panel if you all don't mind. A question that I wanted to ask you, Matthew, to evaluate and analyze data ridership projections, how far back is NJ Transit pulling data for your service that you're putting out?
Well, we really have been tracking continuously over the course of the pandemic, and we index things largely to our most recent pre-pandemic. So that's calendar year 19 or January 2020 in some cases, depending on the fidelity of the data. But what we've largely been doing is indexing to those pre-pandemic conditions immediately pre-pandemic, before things really fell apart, if I could say, and tracking them and really using we've been our internal ridership data and also the market data from Replica's trends model, or trends data, I should say, and reviewing it week over week. So we've used that and developed trends and broken down by market segment, employment type, et cetera, and created various scenario plans based on that data out to the short and medium term.
That's helpful. Thank you. This question I'll ask Leslie and maybe Arthur as well, but they're interested in just hearing from all of you how transit agencies and planners are approaching what if asks and how Replica data might figure into that.
I'll just mention it very broadly, and I feel like everything's a what if these days. I mean, we really don't know what's going to continue, what's not going to continue, how transit is, how our scheduling, how our funding, how people are going to use us moving forward. A lot of that depends on areas that are outside of, our control here in Philadelphia as we deal with outside resources, on crime issues and the other public health issues, that we've mentioned. But it has been really helpful. We used it a lot, just trying to figure out what the scenarios would be and where we fall within those scenarios. What we predicted, how things look like if there was another, wave, if people were directed to work from home again in big ways, and what that would look like. So, that's my comment, that I feel like everything we do these days is what if. We'll see. Obviously, we talk with our other colleagues across the country and what they're experiencing. I know it was mentioned before. I think Matthew mentioned it. We do plan on seeing a continued slow growth, but we're just not sure, where that's going to go.
And thanks, Leslie. And I'll just add that the analysis that I sort of presented on is sort of the type of what if that Leslie is talking about as well, right? Looking at where has something been successful and what if that happened elsewhere? Like, what other places can we apply that to? which is something that you can use today. However, you can also use our scenario tool, which is our sort of forward-looking analysis that builds on the Places tool, which is where I gathered all the insights from today, which is sort of a baseline of what we see in the transit network and in the built environment in general. And the scenario tool allows you to say, what happens if people working from home start to decline, that percentage starts to decline by a certain percentage over the next couple of years, or population growth increases, and a specific employment sector increases in your region. But also what we're working on and is currently in QA right now is for that tool to feature built environment changes. So what happens if I remove a lane of highway, or what happens if I add a transit route to my service? That is also part of the scenario product that we're very much looking forward to.
Thanks, Arthur. I also just want to say thanks, Thomas. He was responding to a lot of the questions that were coming his way in the Q&A portion. So hopefully we got answers there on his questions. Last question for you, Arthur. If Replica data can give data on travel modes, rather, how do we distinguish between those modes? So for example, bicyclists versus pedestrians, or traffic versus transit, if you want to share in just our last minute here.
Yeah, I'd love to. And that's a really good question. I think what we do differently is we're not trying to identify or make sense of modes based on something like LBS data, saying, hey, how frequently are we seeing LBS pings, and seeing where we could identify those people as being bicyclists or being people on a bus. We're actually accounting for every single person in the country by creating a synthetic population representative of everyone down to the block group level, and using a network of attributes for something we call persona trainer, which actually trains the types of behaviors that we're seeing locally and for different socioeconomic attributes of different people in that vary regionally, and routing those people on the built environment based on what we know about the use of that built environment, like the transit ridership data, based on what we know about from our location sources, our location data sources, and based on what we know about local activity from our other data sets, and then validating that with the ground truths to make sure that our modeled outputs are correct. But what we end up seeing is that there's a greater representation in sort of, especially for populations where typically might not be captured by things like location-based services data or mobile data.
Thank you, Arthur. And I know that we're just a minute over, so I want to say thank you to all of our panelists for participating today. We so appreciate you bringing your expertise and your experience and having this discussion. I'm sure the discussion will continue. And so if you do have questions, or if you want to get started in Replica, please feel free, if you're a current customer of ours, to log in to studio.replicahq.com to start your own transit analysis. And if you're new here today, or this conversation was important to you and you want to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Matthew and Thomas and Arthur, for participating. We really appreciate you setting aside the time and continuing this conversation.